Over time, the service sector and economies around the world have been continually increasing. Countries like the US, European nations, and Japan have experienced this shift first and to the greatest extent because they can be described as post-industrial. These countries have higher incomes per capita, and as a result, the population's demand grows to include more services. The size of the service sector affects fertility because women participate heavily in these jobs and so have less children. Also, the investment parents must place per child is higher in post-industrialized countries.
China is the world's most popular country, being home to more than 1.3 billion people. China is also the world's second largest economy behind the United States, with the potential of becoming the largest in the future due to its rapid industrialization speed. Historically, the Chinese industry was very focused on the agriculture sector, but it was not until 1978 when Deng Xiaoping, the president, moved the country away from a centrally planned economy towards a more open market economy with capitalistic features. Although China is still the world's leader in its agricultural sector, 10% of its GDP making it up, over the past 50 years, their service sector has grown to include about 43 to 46% of the GDP. In the past 20 years show the biggest growth. As seen in the graph, their service sector really starts to take off from 1985. With regard to its fertility rate, China had an exploding population growth rate under the regime of Mao Zedong, who thought that having more people will lead to faster industrialization. Thus, as seen on the graph from 1960 to about 1974, the fertility rate of women was still above 4. In 1979, however, under the new leadership, China instituted a policy known as the one-child policy, designed to curb the exploding population growth by allowing most couples to only have one child. At that point in time, the Chinese government was worried that the rate of growth would not be sustainable since there was already a high demand for natural resources such as water. Despite the policy being controversial, it has been effective, lowering the fertility rate considerably from approximately 3.5 in the 1970s to 1.5 in the 2000s, where it is right now. Overall, it seems that by the end of the decade, China will probably reach around the 48 to 49% of its GDP, while keeping in the service sector, while keeping a fertility rate of around 1.5.
For India, the service sector hovered around 40% of the nation's GDP from 1960 to the late 80s. This is largely due to the fact that during this time, India was involved in multiple military campaigns, like the conflicts with Pakistan over the status of Bangladesh, and later peacekeeping efforts in Sri Lanka. This caused India to invest in military spending, primarily a part of the industrial sector, instead of developing its service sector. Beginning in 1990, the service sector starts to take up a larger percentage of India's GDP. This is a direct result of the economic reforms of Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao, who revolutionized India's economy, ridding the nation of barriers to entrepreneurship upheld by former leaders. He is responsible for India's dominant role in IT services, a major factor that pushed India's service sector past the 15% mark of its GDP. The growth of the service sector is one of the many factors that have contributed to the declining fertility rates in India. The increase in college and universities and the enrollment in those institutions began to quickly increase around 1990, the same time India's economy was shifting more toward services. Logically, if parents must invest more per child for higher education, they will have less children.
While the United States has had a large portion of its GDP come from the service sector for a long time, it really begins to pick up during Reagan's presidency. Reagan was an advocate of free trade, creating such policies as the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which seeks to remove all borders to trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. One of Reagan's lasting impacts as president was increasing free trade. As a result of this increase, U.S. companies began outsourcing jobs more heavily right around this time. The jobs it outsourced were almost entirely in the manufacturing or secondary sector. According to a report by the Economic Policy Institute, 2.3 million U.S. jobs were lost between 2001 and 2013 as a result of increasing trade deficit with China, with about two-thirds of the jobs being manufacturing. Once these jobs were lost, the United States was forced to shift to a much more service-based economy, which explains the huge vertical shift in the graph. In terms of the fertility rate, it varies slightly at a couple points on the graph, but generally hovers around 1.9. Unlike India, when the rate changed, it increased rather than decreased. The one large period where the fertility decrease was in the 1970s, which was around the gas shortage where the price of energy was extremely high.